The story of the railway is one of the great triumphs of industrial ambition. Engineers in the mid-19th century looked at a world connected by horse and mud, and they built something faster. The timeline is clean, the logic is obvious. Demand grew, infrastructure followed. Cities expanded, populations moved, and the railway terminal became the front door of the modern city. That explanation is taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, and it holds together until you start measuring the buildings. Because the buildings don't match the timeline. Not by a small margin. Not by a decade. In some cases, the physical scale of what was constructed in the 1840s and 1850s exceeded the actual passenger traffic of that era by a factor that, when you look at the raw numbers, takes a moment to absorb. The platforms were longer than the trains running on them. The waiting halls were taller than any civic purpose of that period seemed to require. And this wasn't one architect's overreach. It was a pattern, repeated, consistent, continent-wide. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's start with what the record actually shows. When King's Cross Station opened in London in 1852, its great arched train sheds, twin barrel vaulted structures, each spanning over 100 feet, were described by contemporaries as breathtaking. The engineering press admired them. The public marveled. But the ridership figures for that first decade were modest by any measure. The Great Northern Railway was carrying meaningful but not extraordinary volumes. The infrastructure, by contrast, was built to handle something considerably larger than what existed. The standard explanation is forward planning. The architects and railway companies, the argument goes, were anticipating growth. They were visionaries. They built ahead. That explanation is reasonable. It is also worth examining carefully, because forward planning as a concept has limits. An engineer plans ahead for 10 years, perhaps 20. He estimates population curves, trade projections, freight requirements. He builds a structure that will remain useful as those numbers climb. That is rational. What becomes harder to explain is when the structure built in 1850 was still, by some measures, not fully utilized until the early 20th century. That is not planning ahead. That is building for a future that was 60 or 70 years away. And the question that follows from that is simple: how did they know? St. Pancras, which opened in 1868, is perhaps the most dramatic example in the British record. The train shed designed by William Barlow was, at the time of construction, the largest enclosed space in the world. The single-span iron roof stretched 245 feet across. The height from track level to the apex of the roof was 100 feet. The scale was, in every sense of the word, extraordinary. But extraordinary compared to what? The Midland Railway, which commissioned St. Pancras, was a successful and profitable operation. It had real passengers, real freight, real revenue. Yet the volume of traffic entering St. Pancras in its early decades occupied a fraction of the physical space that had been provided. Contemporary accounts actually note how grand and cavernous the station felt, not as a compliment to future capacity, but as an observation about present emptiness. The building was not slightly oversized. It was vast for what it was being used for. Standard historical framing treats this as confidence. The Victorians believed in expansion, they built boldly, they invested in the future. And there is genuine truth in that framing. Victorian Britain was not short of ambition. But ambition alone doesn't explain the engineering precision applied to spaces that would sit underutilized for generations. Ambition might explain building bigger. It doesn't fully explain building exactly the right size for a demand curve that was decades away from materializing. Move to continental Europe and the pattern holds its shape. Frankfurt's old Hauptbahnhof, which opened in 1888, was immediately described as the largest railway station in the world. Its main hall contained 24 platforms under 3 enormous parallel train sheds. The city of Frankfurt at that time had a population of approximately 180,000 people. 24 platforms. For a city of 180,000. For context, railway terminals of similar platform count today serve metropolitan populations in the millions, with high-frequency commuter networks layered onto long-distance lines. Frankfurt in 1888 had neither the metropolitan spread nor the commuter culture that such infrastructure implies. The station grew into its capacity over decades. By the mid-20th century, it was among the busiest rail hubs in Europe. But that convergence of scale and demand took the better part of 60 years to arrive. Again, the explanation offered is confident foresight. German engineering tradition, imperial ambition, long-term investment logic. These are not invented explanations. They reflect how historians understand that period. And yet, the anomaly that deserves attention is not any single station. It is the consistency of the pattern. If one city built a terminal too large for its era, that is an architect's ambition. If two cities did it, that is a trend. If the pattern appears across London, Frankfurt, Brussels, Vienna, Budapest, Milan, and simultaneously across the Atlantic in cities like Washington, Chicago, and Cincinnati, within a remarkably compressed window of construction, the explanation of individual foresight begins to carry more weight than the evidence comfortably supports. These were not the same architects. They were not the same railway companies. In many cases, they were not even the same governments. And yet the scale decisions they made, the ceiling heights, the span widths, the platform lengths, the proportions of the public hall, converge on dimensions that seem calibrated to something beyond what was currently being used. Some of these stations had hydraulic systems, ventilation layouts, and subfloor infrastructures whose full function was not documented clearly in the construction records that survive. Some had access tunnels to levels that were later sealed or repurposed. Not all of these details are explained by the timelines attached to them. Researchers examining these buildings from an architectural history perspective have noted, carefully and without drama, that the structural decisions made in some terminals appear to anticipate needs that were not yet present, and in a few cases, needs that were never formally recorded as having been anticipated at all. That is an uncomfortable thing to sit with. Because if the buildings were built for a demand that didn't yet exist, and if the builders left limited documentation explaining how they arrived at those exact dimensions, then the gap between what was built and what was needed isn't just a curiosity. It's a question. And that question, when you start tracing it across enough cities, across enough decades, across enough continents, begins to feel like it wants a different kind of answer than the one we've been given. There is a useful exercise that architectural historians sometimes perform. Take a railway terminal from the 1860s or 1870s, strip away the identifying signage, remove any regional stylistic details, and simply measure it. Measure the platform lengths. Measure the vault heights. Measure the width of the public concourse relative to the population it was built to serve. Then line those measurements up against terminals from different countries, different decades within that window, different political systems. What you find, when you do this carefully, is a degree of proportional consistency that is difficult to attribute purely to coincidence. Not identical buildings. The ornamentation differs. The materials reflect local industry. The facades carry the signatures of their regional architectural traditions. But the functional volumes, the spaces designed to move and hold human beings, cluster around proportions that suggest a shared logic, a shared sense of what the correct scale was supposed to be. The question of where that shared logic came from is one that the historical record answers only partially. In the United States, the story of the great railway terminals carries its own version of this pattern, and in some respects, the American examples are even harder to square with the standard explanation. Washington Union Station, completed in 1908, is often cited as one of the finest examples of Beaux-Arts civic architecture in the country. Its main hall, the so-called Main Hall, is 96 feet tall, 130 feet wide, and 760 feet long. It was modeled, in part, on the baths of Diocletian in Rome. The station could, at its theoretical capacity, process hundreds of thousands of passengers per day. In the years immediately following its opening, it did not come close to that. Washington, D.C. in 1908 was not a small city, but it was not yet the metropolitan hub its infrastructure implied. The federal government was large, but not yet at the scale that would justify a terminal of this magnitude on pure passenger arithmetic. The building's defenders point correctly to its symbolic function. It was a statement of national ambition, a monument to the idea of the capital as a world city. That is a legitimate reading. But monumental ambition and operational overpreparation are not the same thing. A building can be designed to impress without being designed to function at a scale decades ahead of actual use. Union Station was both. The question of why it needed to function at that scale, with the operational infrastructure, the platform arrangements, the underground logistics systems, before the demand existed, is one that symbolic intention alone doesn't fully resolve. Chicago's history of railway terminals is particularly dense with this pattern. At its peak, Chicago had 6 major railway terminals operating simultaneously. 6. For a period in the late 19th and early 20th century, Chicago was arguably the most railway-intensive city on Earth, with more terminal infrastructure per capita than any comparable metropolitan center. The standard explanation for this is Chicago's geography, its position as the natural convergence point for rail lines running east-west and north-south across the continent. That explanation is accurate. Chicago's geography is real. Its role as a rail hub is historically documented and economically logical. And yet the speed at which that infrastructure appeared, and the scale at which it appeared before Chicago's population and trade volumes had fully justified it, remains a point that careful historians flag without always resolving. Some of the terminal infrastructure built in Chicago in the 1870s and 1880s was operating below design capacity well into the 20th century. The demand caught up. It always caught up. But the gap between construction and utilization, measured not in years but in decades, appears consistently in city after city, in a way that the visionary planning explanation, while not wrong, perhaps does not entirely account for. The United Kingdom offers additional texture to this picture. Beyond London, the regional terminals built throughout Britain in the mid to late Victorian period display the same proportional excess. Manchester's original London Road Station, later renamed Piccadilly, was rebuilt and expanded in the 1860s to dimensions that its contemporary traffic did not fill. Birmingham's New Street, Liverpool's Lime Street, Edinburgh's Waverley, each of these, in their Victorian configurations, presented platform and concourse arrangements that exceeded near-term operational requirements in ways that the surviving planning documents don't always fully explain. What makes the British examples interesting is the financial context. Railway construction in Britain was privately financed. These were commercial enterprises, accountable to shareholders, operating under genuine capital constraints. The argument that they built purely for symbolic or monumental reasons is harder to sustain in this context than it might be for a government-funded American or European civic project. Private capital, in principle, does not habitually overbuild by margins of decades without a reason. Some researchers have looked at this and suggested that the capital financing the railways, the networks of banking houses and investment structures that underwrote construction across multiple countries simultaneously, may have had access to growth projections or planning assumptions that were not fully made public at the time. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about information asymmetry, that those making scale decisions may have known something about expected demand that was not visible in the publicly available economic data of the period. That observation sits within mainstream economic history. It is not unusual for large capital actors to operate with information advantages. But it does complicate the narrative that each terminal scale was an independent act of local optimism. There is one more layer to this worth examining carefully. Several of the terminals built in this period contain structural features that were either never fully explained in the original documentation, or whose documented purpose shifted over time in ways that don't entirely cohere. Subterranean levels and stations like Street Pancras and certain American terminals were described variously as freight handling facilities, ventilation infrastructure, or service corridors. But the physical dimensions of some of these spaces exceeded what those functions would seem to require. Some of these lower levels were sealed in the 20th century. Some were repurposed. In a small number of cases, the original documentation for why they were built to the dimensions they were built to is incomplete. This is not inherently suspicious. Records are lost. Priorities change. Infrastructure gets repurposed constantly over a century and a half of use. But when the surface of a building is already overscaled for its era, and the subsurface of that same building contains additional unaccounted for volume, the cumulative picture begins to invite a question that the standard narrative of Victorian railway ambition doesn't quite close off. Some researchers, looking at this accumulated pattern across countries and decades, have begun grouping these observations under a broader interpretive framework. A label that, in online and alternative research communities, has developed a specific gravity. That label and what it does and doesn't actually claim is worth examining carefully. The word Tartaria appears in historical maps. That much is not contested. On European cartographic documents from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, large portions of Central Asia and Siberia are labeled with variations of this name: Tartaria Magna, Tartaria Chinensis, Independent Tartary. These were real designations used by real cartographers, referring to regions populated by Turkic and Mongolic peoples that European mapmakers grouped under a broad geographic label. The word has a documented history. It appears in encyclopedias, in diplomatic correspondence, in travel literature. What it did not refer to in any of those documents was a unified civilization with advanced architectural or engineering capacity. That is the point where the historical record and the contemporary interpretive framework diverge. Because in certain research communities, distributed primarily across online platforms, drawing on a mix of architectural observation, photographic analysis, and alternative historiography, Tartaria has come to function as something different from its cartographic origins. It has become a label, a container, a term applied to a specific set of anomalies, buildings that appear overscaled for their documented era, infrastructure that seems to precede the demand it was built to serve, architectural styles that repeat across geographies with a consistency that feels, to those examining them, like it requires a shared origin. The railway terminals fit inside this container for those who use it. It is worth being precise about what the Tartaria interpretive framework actually claims, and what it does not, because the range of claims made under this label is considerably wider than any single coherent argument. At one end of the spectrum, there are researchers who use Tartaria to describe nothing more than an organizational hypothesis, that certain architectural and infrastructural anomalies across the 19th century may share a common origin or a common set of planning assumptions that mainstream history has not fully accounted for. This version of the argument is cautious, comparative, and in some respects methodologically continuous with legitimate architectural history. It asks questions. It compares measurements. It flags gaps in documentation. At the other end of the spectrum, the label carries far heavier claims, assertions about erased civilizations, deliberate suppression of historical memory, and coordinated falsification of the documentary record. These claims move well beyond what the architectural evidence on its own can support. The existence of an overscaled railway terminal does not demonstrate that a civilization was erased. A gap in construction documentation does not constitute evidence of coordinated concealment. The leap from observation to conclusion at this end of the spectrum is significant. Most researchers engaging seriously with these architectural anomalies occupy neither extreme. They sit in the more uncomfortable middle ground, acknowledging that the standard explanations don't close every gap, while also acknowledging that alternative explanations require evidence that, so far, has not been produced in a form that meets the standards of historical verification. What the terminals themselves offer, when examined without either framework imposed on them, is a set of genuine and unresolved observations. The scale decisions made in the 1840s through the 1880s, across multiple countries and multiple independent railway enterprises, produced infrastructure that consistently exceeded near-term operational requirements. That is documentable. The gap between construction scale and utilization, in several prominent cases, stretched across multiple decades. That is also documentable. The explanations offered, visionary planning, symbolic ambition, capital confidence, geographic strategy, are each partially persuasive and collectively incomplete. There are also smaller details that don't resolve cleanly. Some terminal buildings from this period contain stonework and masonry techniques that later engineering analysis has described as unusually refined for the documented construction timeline. Not impossible, but refined in ways that prompt questions about the labor capacity and technical knowledge available at the stated time of construction. Some terminals were built at speeds that, when measured against the documented workforce sizes and available technology, produce output per worker figures that historians of construction technology flag as high, without always providing a satisfying explanation for why. These are not dramatic revelations. They are small frictions in the record. But small frictions, when they appear consistently across enough examples, tend to mean one of two things. Either the standard model is missing something, or the anomalies are the result of documentation gaps that future research will eventually fill. Both of those possibilities remain open. One interpretation, held by a subset of architectural historians working outside the alternative research community, is more prosaic than either the mainstream or the Tartaria framework suggests. This interpretation proposes that the railway terminal boom of the mid-19th century drew on a pre-existing body of construction knowledge and physical infrastructure that has been incompletely attributed. That the great building programs of the Victorian era did not begin from zero, that they inherited, modified, and reoccupied structures and systems whose earlier history was either poorly recorded or subsequently underemphasized in the narrative of industrial progress. This is not a fringe position. Architectural reuse across centuries is well documented in European history. Roman infrastructure was incorporated into medieval construction. Medieval foundations were built upon by Renaissance architects. The question of whether something similar occurred at scale during the railway era, whether terminals were built into, around, or upon structures whose original construction predated the Victorian attribution, is one that some researchers consider worth investigating, and one that the surviving physical evidence does not definitively rule out. This interpretation requires no hidden civilization. It requires only that the historical record of construction in certain cases is less complete than it appears. The Tartaria label, whatever its limitations, has done one thing that is difficult to dismiss entirely. It has gathered, under a single searchable term, a body of photographic, architectural, and documentary observations that would otherwise remain scattered across separate research traditions. The label functions as an index. People who might never have encountered the Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof's platform-to-population ratio, or the subsurface dimensions of certain American terminals, or the compressed construction timelines of Beaux-Arts civic buildings, now encounter them together, in sequence, in comparison, in accumulating weight. Whether that accumulation points toward a coherent alternative history, or simply toward a set of questions that mainstream historiography has been slow to systematically address, is something that the evidence as it currently stands does not resolve. What the terminals themselves suggest, quietly, in their proportions, in their vaulted heights, in their platforms that waited decades to fill, is that the official story of why they were built, and built at that scale, and built at that moment, may be accurate in its broad strokes while remaining incomplete in ways that matter. History is rarely falsified cleanly. More often, it is simply told at a resolution too low to catch everything. The railway terminals of the 19th century were built for something. The trains came. The passengers came.